Morning. 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 All right. No Las Vegas poetry today. Yeah. That was kind of weird, huh? So we're going to try to get through some stuff in John, a little bit of a review because we've been a little inconsistent last couple classes. The big idea in John, of course, is that there is life or eternal life. We talk about life beginning now, in the here and now. Hold on just a sec. All right, now I'm happy. So it begins with that poem talking about that Jesus is the Word or the Logos or the eternal being, and that he comes to bring us life. Then we go into the John the Baptist story, and the big difference in the John the Baptist story compared to the Synoptics was that John was calling Jesus the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And from there, which is hearkening back to the Passover, to the Exodus. And then John the disciple starts following John the disciple who's following John the Baptist starts following Jesus. And he brings the other disciples with him. We find out he's from Nazareth, which is kind of a hillbilly town, but as these guys come into interaction with him, they all begin to believe that he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And then the very first thing they do, if you recall, remember the first thing they do together? Yeah, the wedding feast, the party. So they go to the wedding feast, they run out of wine. Jesus is manipulated by his mother, one way or another, into making wine out of the ceremonial washing jars. And they have this sort of festive party. It's how the whole thing kicks off, which is pretty clear symbolism. I tend to believe there's way more symbolism in John than the Synoptics, and the better you know the Hebrew Scriptures, the better you see some of it. But here I think, especially John the Baptist calling him the Lamb of God, in the prophets you have this imagery called the wedding supper of the Lamb. And so the promise is that one day God will come to his people, make everything right, and it will be celebrated in this huge party, this wedding. So this, starting the story off as John does with this, is to say that Jesus has ushered in this era of the presence of God, which will feel like a party. It will be like a wedding feast. And so from there, though, we don't keep the party going so much as we go to the temple, right? They go straight to the temple, and Jesus rips up the temple with his hands and kind of like, not the temple itself, but turns over tables, shoos animals away. This is his prophetic sort of indictment against the temple system and how it has become corrupt, especially how it has favored the rich over the poor. And so we're starting to see a picture in John of how Jesus will be king and what it means that he's Messiah. And the first thing, of course, is that he brings the goodness of God. And then the second thing is that he has something to say, that he's a prophet, that he is a revolutionary, and that he's come to in essence, figuratively, destroy the temple, destroy that system, so that we can worship in spirit and truth, and so that the poor have access to God just as much as the rich do. Right after that is the account of Nicodemus, which is one of the Pharisees who comes to Jesus in the middle of the night and asks him certain questions, and here we get this other theme. It's almost, I think, intended to be a little bit of comedy in John, in that the enemies of Jesus can't understand metaphor at all. So, or not just the enemies, but it's kind of anyone Jesus encounters struggles with metaphor. So here we have with Nicodemus, him asking Jesus, how do I enter the kingdom of God? And Jesus says, you must be born again. And he's like, oh, that sounds gross. How do you be born again? I can't go in my mother's womb. That's disgusting. And he's like, no, it's spiritual. You must be born of the Spirit, born of the wind, live a new life, born again. Nicodemus still doesn't get it, and this is when Jesus says the John 3:16 passage in third person. So he says, God so loved the world that he sent his son, his only son into the world to save the world. And then Nicodemus ends up rejecting Jesus' message, sort of. He just doesn't get it, and he wanders away. And I said Nicodemus will come back at the end of the story. He's actually one of the people that helps get Jesus' body off the cross. So there's this untold story of Nicodemus throughout the Gospel of John that he goes from one who is confused by Jesus, should be one of his enemies because he's a Pharisee, to somehow at the end being close enough to him to take his body down. And that's important because there's very little hope in John for religious people. Like, it just seems like every religious person can't get it. But at least in Nicodemus we see he somehow gets it. Then last week, right before Sean did his poetry stuff, I talked about the Samaritan woman. So Jesus goes through Samaria, even though he normally would not. And this woman who's a prostitute comes up to him, and they have this interesting exchange at the well. And it ends with Jesus telling her, I'll give you magic. I call it magic water. I think that's what it would have sounded like to her. Jesus actually calls it living water, water that's alive. And so she ends up receiving this, believing that he is Messiah. And this is when he says to her, you don't have to worship at the temple. You don't have to worship on this mountain. True worshipers of God can worship God in spirit and in truth wherever they are. Revolutionary, right? So this part of what this does is believing, and this may seem really, probably ought to seem very normal thing for us to believe, that you can worship God wherever you are, because Jesus taught us that, and it's 2,000 years later, and as Christians we tried to live this out. But in this culture, worship was very much localized in holy places and in buildings. So you could not worship God really deeply until you got to the temple. Or for the Samaritans, they couldn't worship God deeply until they got to this mountain. So it would be like us believing you couldn't really worship God until you went to, church on Sunday or went to the Vatican to see the Pope or something like that. And Jesus is saying, no, God's bigger than that. You can worship him in the temple, sure, but anywhere else as well. So Jesus is, again, opening up this reality of the presence of God everywhere we go. And then in Samaria is the first big sort of conversion of a whole town to believing in Jesus and believing who he is, which is, again, can't overstate how much hatred and racism there was between the Jews and Samaritans. So it's again, in John, there's always the story, right? And then more than in the synoptics, there's the meaning behind the story. And so here we have the story, which is a great story with this woman in this town, but the meaning behind the story is that Jesus came to his enemies. He came first. The first people to receive him were the people that you would think would hate him. So that we ought not be surprised, because John is writing 100 years later, we ought not be surprised that then the gospel's spreading to all these other places that we might not expect it to go. The next story, we're going to try to get through chapter 8 or 9 here today, so three or four chapters. So the next story is there's this pool, and think of it, it's like a place where people might bathe that can be visible from the temple. And there was this non-biblical myth that had developed around this pool, that whenever the waters were stirred, which I suppose could be the wind blowing or whatever, whenever the waters started to move, what the people began to believe is that an angel came and stirred the waters. And they believed that the first person who could get into this pool, and don't think of it like a public pool, it's like a water feature, right? So the first person that could get into this pool would be healed of whatever their problem was. So as a result, this pool became a place where people with all sorts of different ailments and physical deformities and illnesses would gather. And they would sleep there and they would stay there waiting for the water to move. And when the water moved, they would all rush to jump into the pool. The story of John seems to make it clear that John doesn't think this is true. He doesn't think this is actually happening, but it's a superstition that the people have. So Jesus, and the pool is in, the location of it is important because Jesus goes to this area on a Sabbath day when he's not supposed to be working. And of course, one of the 10 Commandments is that you have to rest on the Sabbath day and not work. It's tricky for Jesus because his job is speaking and preaching, and his job is healing. And so the Pharisees would say, when Jesus heals someone on a Sabbath day, he's sinning because he's supposed to be resting. And Jesus will always say, if God has given me the power to heal someone, why wouldn't I do it on the Sabbath day? It makes no sense. The Sabbath was made, Jesus would say, for us to rest, but it was not made to contain the love and the power of God. So they had this constant sort of battle going around, should Jesus be healing on the Sabbath or not? And also the Pharisees are looking for reasons to discredit Jesus and ultimately at some point to arrest him. So in full sight of the Pharisees and the temple, Jesus goes one day to start walking around these people who are waiting for the waters to move. And he comes to a man who can't walk. And he says to him, "Do you want to be healed?" And the man says, "I do, but I can't walk. And every time the waters are moved, everybody who can walk beats me to the pool. So if you would just, stay around and basically throw me in when the waters are moved, that would be great." And Jesus says, no. Jesus wasn't saying, "Do you want me to help you with this?" He was asking, "Do you want me to heal you now?" He says, "Do you want to be healed?" And he says, "Yes." And he tells him to get up, pick up his mat, and walk. And this is one of those amazing Jesus physical healings. The man gets up, and he picks up his mat, and he rejoices. Of course, he's happy. He thanks Jesus, and he goes on his way. And as he's walking, one of the Pharisees stops him and says, "What are you doing carrying your mat and walking? This is the Sabbath day. You're supposed to rest." And he says, "Well, he tells him the story. I was an invalid. I couldn't walk. This Jesus healed me. He told me to take up my mat. Seems like, maybe okay to break the Sabbath rule on this one." And they are furious with him, and they end up being furious with Jesus as well. That story is sort of preemptive to another story very similar to it that we're going to kind of close today with. But both of them have the same idea going on, that Jesus is bringing the power and the love of God every day of the week. And to the religious people, it's very hard for them to accept that. This may seem weird to us because I think we're not that into obeying laws around rest. But remember, the Pharisees were all about trying to be perfect so that God would come and rescue them. And of all the commandments that they were given, the one to rest was the most sort of vague one. And it was probably supposed to be vague on purpose in some ways. But the command is just remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And rest from your work. Work 6 days a week, but on the seventh day rest. That's the commandment. So they wrote volumes of books about what it meant to rest. And it really did make the day of rest the most stressful day of the week for most people because they didn't know. Like if, in my case, my dog runs away every other day. If my dog runs away on the Sabbath, do I go after him? Is that work or not? And with them, it was usually farm animals or whatever. If my lamb runs away or my goat runs away or my ox runs away, how far? And they would have rules. You can go after him for 300 yards and then you must stop. There were rules about women cooking. How much can we cook on a Sabbath day? Well, try to cook as much as you can right before, and then, there's certain things you can and can't cook, and they even had these elaborate, we know historically, some elaborate kind of levee systems to even move things around on the Sabbath in your house so that you wouldn't have to actually carry them. So obviously it becomes very sort of intense, ritualistic, and Jesus comes and just sort of blows it all away. He says, "This is ridiculous. The Sabbath was made to give us rest, and you guys are making it stressful." But to the Pharisees, it's like murder. Like he's breaking one of the big 10 commandments. The next story with Jesus then is he's teaching, and this is a feeding story. We have them in the Synoptics too, where he's going to feed a bunch of people all at once. And there's 5,000 men that he's teaching. So this is almost at the very height of his popularity. That's a lot of people. So I know this is silly, but they didn't have microphones back then. So you can imagine how exhausting it might have been to try to teach 5,000 people. There's 120 people here. Not today, some people slept in, but whatever. So, if there's 120, 140 in here, imagine 10 times this crowd is 1,000, and then imagine 5 times that. So just a ton of people. And Jesus, of course, would scream to everyone, but he would also probably walk around and teach the same thing over and over to each little group of people. And they would hang out all day, and you can imagine being there all day, and Jesus has been teaching things, and you can barely hear him. He finally comes to your group, and now you're hearing him say the things. And so people were not leaving. They were all staying around to hear Jesus and to learn from him. As time came, as evening came, they realized that these people hadn't eaten all day. Most of them, again, are poor peasants. The disciples come up to Jesus and they say, Jesus, these people haven't eaten all day. They've been listening to your teach. We should dismiss them before it gets too late so that they can try to go back to town and find some food. And Jesus says, don't we have anything to feed them? And one of the disciples says, Jesus, it would take 8 months' wages. It would take thousands and thousands of dollars to feed 5,000 people. We don't have any money. And they say, all we have is this boy that has, some fish, like 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. I forget exactly, maybe 5 fish, 2 breads. You get it. Just a little bit of fish and bread. And Jesus says, that's great. He takes the food, he says a prayer, and he blesses it, and he has everyone sort of sit down in groups. Then he starts distributing the bread and the fish. And everyone eats their fill. He tells the disciples to go gather what's left over. And there's 12 baskets full. They had a little bit of food, and now there's 12 baskets full left over that the people couldn't even eat. And 12, again, in the Bible is a number that reflects wholeness, that reflects perfection. So the idea here is very similar to the wedding feast, right? Jesus comes and he fills us. He gives us everything we need, overflowing, so that we actually end up with more food than we started with, and 5,000 people were able to eat. Now, in the story, though, the people are so excited about this that they are ready to make Jesus king right then and there, and this makes sense. If they're legitimately peasants and they're poor, they don't know where their next meal is coming from. Jesus' teachings on this are so important when he says, trust God to give you food, right? God feeds the birds of the air, he'll feed you too. In this story, they begin to sort of, I always imagine if they start kind of chanting, make him king, make him king, make him king. And now you have these thousands of people. If there were 5,000 men there were probably 12, 15,000 men, women, and children. And so they start screaming and, getting kind of all riled up, like at a certain person political's rally maybe. Getting all excited. Marco Rubio, of course. So, thank you. And they're going nuts. They want him to be king because this person just did a miracle to feed them. Remember back in the Synoptics, one of the temptations of Jesus is to turn stones to bread, which means to get a following just by feeding people. And so Jesus realizes here that they are ready to revolt. They can march on the temple. They can destroy the temple if they want, destroy that whole system. They can march on, the palace of Pilate, and they could, try to overthrow Roman control. This would have been the most sort of riled up group that had been around in a long time, ready for revolution, and they will do whatever Jesus says. Jesus does something very typically Jesus in this moment. He does not seize the opportunity. He says it's not time. He actually slips through the crowd, runs away into the wilderness. He goes and he hides and he prays. He tells the disciples to get in the boat and go to the other side of the lake. So they do. So they leave this mob that's so excited to make him king. In the middle of the night, it's dark, so they can kind of slip out. And the disciples are going to the other side of the lake. Jesus says, I will meet you on the other side of the lake. And he goes the other direction. The crowd dissipates somewhat in the middle of the night while everyone's sleeping. Jesus comes out of the wilderness. He's going to meet the disciples. And he's walking in, the quickest way to get anywhere is a straight line. So he's walking on the water, the Bible says, to the other side of the lake. The disciples see him and they're weirded out by it. And they bring him in the boat. And then they get to the other side of the lake. It's interesting, the whole walking on the water thing in John is very like just almost a throwaway. He's walking on the water. That's not the big point of this story. He gets to the other side of the lake and he sleeps. Now they're sleeping in the boat. They've been up all night. It's been a crazy night. They hear noises. They wake up to people cheering, chanting, make him king, give us food, 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 Now there's more than before. They've followed him all the way around the lake, and there's maybe 10,000 plus people. Imagine waking up to that, Jesus coming out on the bow of the boat, and they're going nuts for him. And he knows what they want more than anything is food. And he's going to choose that this not be the way that he attains power, by giving them food, because what he realizes, I would assume, is they're going to do this every 4 hours, forever. Like, it has to be based on more than just food. And so he's on the bow of the boat, And he in essence says, "Do you want food?" And they all scream, "Yeah!" He says, "I'm going to give you spiritual food." Wah, wah, right? And it's like, oh, what does that mean? He says, "I am the bread of life. Anyone who wants to be with me must eat that bread." And he starts going metaphor again. People in John don't like it when Jesus goes metaphor. One of the guys in the crowd says, "But Moses gave us real food. He gave us manna in the wilderness. Give us real food." And Jesus says, "Moses didn't give you real food. God gave you food. God will give you food. But this is real food I'm talking about. This is real spiritual food." And then it seems as if my take on this story is that they aren't getting it, and Jesus gets more and more sort of passionate about this spiritual food, that he starts saying it more and more literally, and it starts freaking the people out. He says, you really want to be part of me? I'm the bread of life. Eat the bread of life. You really want to be part of me? Eat me. Eat me. Drink my blood. You can't, I'm talking about my flesh. Eat my real flesh and drink my blood, or you can have no part in me. And they're all just totally freaked out. One guy says, "Jesus, this is a hard teaching to understand." He says, "What's so hard about it? Come up here and eat my body and drink my blood." And they all leave. 10,000 of them turn around and walk away. And Jesus has effectively now run off everyone. So it's important to get this sort of emotional thing that's going on here in this story. Jesus' fame and notoriety is a little bit like a wave or a roller coaster that goes like this and then hits these big crescendos. And this is the second, there's going to be one more big one before he dies. But this has, thousands of people loving him. And with one teaching, everyone leaves him except the 12 disciples. And they're on the boat with him. And there's this sort of tender moment, how I take it, where Jesus is sitting on the boat after everyone's left, and he turns to the disciples and he says, "Everyone's left. Are you going to leave me too? Are you leaving me too?" And Peter speaks. He usually does. Peter says, "We're not leaving you. We got nowhere else to go." Which is a really honest answer, I think. Like, we've already aligned with you. I think implied in that is maybe we don't get what you're saying either. He says, "We have nowhere else to go. Besides, you have words of life. Your words give life." Jesus, I think, what John is trying to show us pretty clearly, is that there were teachings of Jesus that were hard to understand. There were teachings of Jesus that there were metaphors he used that felt so confusing that even people that wanted him to be king, wanted to be Messiah, could sometimes be turned off by him. And this is pretty clear. It may be Jesus doing some of this stuff on purpose to sort of pace out his popularity to get to where he was trying to go at the end. But I don't apply much in this stuff, I know, to real life, but I would think this is important to pause and think about. That in following Jesus today, if you really put your whole heart and life into trying to follow the teachings of Jesus and the person of Jesus, and if it seems incredibly easy, you may not have a full picture of Jesus yet. Obviously, there are things about following Jesus that make life better, and it's easy to see. But there are also things about following him that will make life more difficult and more confusing. And going into discipleship with him, and it has to be part of what John is trying to say here to his church a generation or two later. Some of this is hard to understand. Some of it is difficult. But shouldn't it be? I mean, if he was the Son of God, would you expect everything to be instantly easy to get? He's God. So, you have to go with him on this journey to the end. And by the end of the story, you will begin to see how it all ties together. And specifically in this story, it's going to tie together with John. It's with the Last Supper, when Jesus will say, "Eat this bread, this is my body, and drink this wine, this is my blood." But Jesus is sort of teaching this before he actually has the metaphor to teach it, so it's super confusing to people. Jesus will then, start to gain more and more followers back. Many people will come back, especially, again, those marginalized. So the prostitutes, the poor. There's a story that's located in John chapter 8. It may be my favorite story in the entire scriptures. The interesting thing about it is, it was sort of just back up just a little bit in terms of how it got into the book of John. It probably wasn't in the original text of John. Sometimes this story is found located at the very end of Luke. It happens in the temple courts in Jerusalem, so it has to be a time when Jesus is in Jerusalem. And so there is debate about whether this story should even be in the scriptures. Some people say, no, this is a later addition, it shouldn't be in there. Some people say, it should be in there, it's an oral tradition that was just left out and they put it back in. My take on all that is this, that for whatever reason this story made it in. And my hunch is that it meant so much to the early church, this particular story. I think this story very much is the gospel in microcosm, that they wanted it reflected in their scriptures. So the story goes that Jesus was teaching in the temple courts, teaching his normal crowd. And as he was teaching, you can imagine from the distance, there's this sort of chaos. And there's a group of Pharisees. So imagine them, dressed in their religious garbs, very clean, very upstanding men, and they're dragging something as they come to Jesus, and people are screaming along the way. It's a really, strange incident. Stops everything. People are looking. Mothers are covering the eyes of their children and running away. And as they get closer and closer, you begin to see that they're dragging a woman naked through the streets. And she's trying to cover herself up. They're dragging her by her arms or her hair or whatever. And they bring her and they throw her down in front of Jesus. And you can imagine her there in kind of a fetal position, crying, covering herself, completely humiliated and embarrassed. The Pharisees circle Jesus and this woman. And Jesus, had some of his disciples and followers there watching all this happen. And the Pharisees say, Jesus, we caught this woman in the very act of adultery. That's important. We caught her in the very act of adultery. The law of Moses, which you claim to follow, says that this is a capital offense, that we should kill this woman. What do you say? They were looking for an opportunity to trap Jesus. And this is brilliant. This is perfect for them. The law of Moses says that if you catch anyone, not just a woman, in the very act of adultery, which means, it's spelled out what it means, you see them having sex, you have to watch it, which is creepy in and of itself. You have to see it happen, and there have to be at least two of you that see it happen. And the two who saw it happen could not be guilty of that sin themselves. A lot of parameters. Well, they say, the first question you would think what we know of Jesus now would be, he has to know it's a trap. I want to know where the guy is. You caught her. You didn't catch her by herself. Why did you choose to bring a woman and not the guy? Is he a friend of yours? Is he a buddy of yours? Maybe she was set up from the very beginning for this whole thing. Maybe she's a prostitute. Who knows? But all these things have to be trying to figure out, how did they get to this woman? And they're so self-righteous. They have found this woman who has sinned. And why the trap is so brilliant is Jesus can only say one of two things. He can say what you might expect him to say, because he's Jesus, right? He'll say, look, we all screw up. She's forgiven. And that's the end of it. But their religious laws are so tightly joined with their actual, laws and policing, that if Jesus says that, he is clearly going against the law of Moses. And that is grounds for arrest and possibly even a trial and murder, killing him, execution. And so if Jesus just comes straight out and says, let's just have grace, it's like saying this guy just killed somebody and we're going to let him off. It's too far. He can't say that. On the other hand, if he says, the law of Moses is the law of Moses, I can't get around this one. God is a God of justice. Let's kill her. She's supposed to be stoned. Let's stone her right here, right now. If he does that, then all of his followers would leave him, because the important thing to remember is everyone watching Jesus right now is as guilty as this woman is, and he's forgiven them. But now we see this is a great test for him. When he's under sort of political pressure, when his life is really on the line, is he going to stick by his guns and have grace, or is he going to flip and be like the Pharisees and condemn this woman? It says that he bends down on the ground and he kind of doodles in the sand, which I assume I do that when I'm trying to think. Maybe he's just thinking. There are all these theories that people just make up but are kind of fun, that maybe he's writing the names of the women the Pharisees had slept with or something, but he's writing stuff, doodling. Stands back up, and I imagine him grabbing a stone. Doesn't say that. This is a nice theatrical story, right? You can imagine him grabbing a stone, and he steps back, and all these Pharisees are encircled this woman. And he says, this is what we're going to do. She deserves death. And you could hear her begging and crying and pleading for her life, and Jesus' followers murmuring, and it's a chaotic scene. She deserves death for what she's done. She deserves to be stoned. Whoever has not sinned, throw the first stone. You can read this two ways. The easiest way to read this, which is the way I read it most of my life until I did a little more research, was we've all sinned, right? Everybody knows that. So they could be going around the circle thinking, well, I did lie one time, or I did, get mad and punch a guy when I was a teenager, so I'll drop the stone and not throw it at someone because I'm a sinner just like her. I actually think the point of the story, is going back to that law in the scriptures that says the two eyewitnesses should not be guilty of the same sin. This is actually quite a risk for Jesus to take if this is what he means. He may be saying, any of you religious leaders that have not had a sexual sin, that have not done what she was doing or worse, if you're really that pure, cast the first stone. What he does is he doubles back on them and puts them in a dilemma. They believe with all their hearts that the law is the law of God, and if they cast this stone knowing that they've sinned sexually, God will know that. And they will be guilty of this. They'll be guilty of the same sin. They'll be doubly guilty because they've done this bad thing, and now they're killing someone who's done what they did. And there's silence. Nobody says anything. And then it says the oldest guy, the oldest Pharisee, drops a stone. And it almost goes by age. I guess they've had more time. Either they've had more time to sin, or they're wise enough and old enough now to realize he's got him. And they all drop their stones down to the youngest one, and then they just walk away. And this leaves Jesus with a naked, weeping woman and his followers. And it says that he bends down. I would imagine him covering her up in some way with his own clothes or something. He lifts her chin up, and he says, where did they go? Where did those men go who condemned you? They're not here. And I don't condemn you either. But go, and stop it. Stop living like that. It's killing you. That's my paraphrase. I'll give you the exact quote. He lifts her chin up and he says, where are they, those who condemn you? They're not here. I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. Go and sin no more. And in gratitude, she leaves. When it comes to guilt and sin and all this stuff, why I think this story was so important that the church held on to it and kept it in the scriptures is that I think it shows us the posture of God towards our sin. which is not, which Jesus comes to show us is not instant condemnation. It's not letter of the law. It's not you did this, therefore you die. Jesus has come to somehow change that, make that different. It's also not cheap. It's not cheap. He's not pushover God. He's not hippie God. He's not whatever. Like, he wants you to stop doing things that are destroying you. He wants you to stop living part of your life that's drawing you farther away from him. And he's serious about that. But he leads with grace. Leads with grace and then a challenge to holiness. Versus leading with condemnation, holiness, and grace comes after you're perfect. So to me, this story models that for us. The last story of the day, we're going back to where we started, is with the Sabbath stuff. In this story, it's a Sabbath day, and Jesus is walking around with his disciples, and they come across a man who's born blind, can't see. And the disciples pull Jesus aside. They ask him a question. You can imagine this happened all the time. This one was recorded. They're just trying to learn as much as they can, and they say, Jesus, this man who was born blind, was it his sin or the sin of his parents that caused him to be born blind? There was a very common held belief among the Jews of this time that if you had a baby who was born with any sort of deformity, that it had to be sin that caused that. They saw it as punishment. But the big debate, and the Pharisees would have this debate all the time, is who sinned when this happened? Was it the mother or father, and God's punishing them? Or was it somehow that this person was so evil from conception that they were sinning inside the womb? Or that God could somehow foresee in the future that they were going to be a very sinful person and punish them ahead of time? And it was almost a 50-50 divide on when someone was born blind, for instance. Whose fault was it? It couldn't just be something that happened. And the disciples were curious about this. They knew it was a debate at the time. Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus says, neither. So, in typical sort of Jesus fashion, he says, everybody's wrong, they're all dumb, that's not what's going on. Neither. This man was born blind. This man was born blind so that the glory of God could be seen in his life today. And he bends down and interacts with this man again, and asks him if he wants to see. The man says, of course. And Jesus, on the Sabbath day, takes dirt, puts it in his hand, spits in his hand several times, and starts to make mud out of his spit and the dirt in his hand. Kind of a gross story. And the man's just hearing this going on. Jesus starts putting the mud on the man's eyes, right? And he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Have someone take you to the temple, wash in one of those pools, and you'll be able to see. So this guy gets one of his friends to lead him to the temple. He washes in this pool, washes the mud off, opens his eyes, and he can see. And it's a miracle. He comes running back to town. This is a guy that people have grown up with their whole life. They knew was blind. This wasn't just somebody that couldn't see for a few months. His whole life he's been blind, and now he's just kind of, the story goes that he's just kind of like staring at everyone sort of in a creepy fashion because he can see, and he's putting faces to voices, and he's freaking people out because he's looks like the blind guy, but he's clearly not because he loves to see. Like, that's what he does. He just stares at you. And so finally, someone goes up and asks him, who are you? And he says, you know who I am. I've been begging my whole life at the gate. And the guy says, that's not you. It looks like you, but you can clearly see. And that man was blind. He says, yes, I've been healed. And they're all amazed. Well, how are you healed? He says, yesterday, the man named Jesus, he came and he spit mud. He spit in the dirt. He made mud somehow, and he put it on my eyes. He told me to go walk to the pool of Siloam and wash. And when I washed, I could see. It's a miracle. And they say, wait, when? Yesterday, on the Sabbath? Yeah, I guess so. Well, that man's a sinner. And they take the man who's been born blind and they bring him into a meeting of the Pharisees. And now they're all gathered around him trying to figure out. They say, tell us again how it is you were able to see. He says, okay, yesterday on the Sabbath, this man named Jesus came. He asked me if I wanted to see. He spit on the ground. He made mud. He put it in my eyes, told me to go wash. And again, they said, wait. He made mud on the Sabbath. It's specifically, in all those books I talked about, there's a line that says you can't make mud on a Sabbath day. He straight up broke it. And here's the thing with Jesus. He didn't have to do that. He could have healed him without the mud. He's obviously, I think, Jesus picking a little fight here in the way he does it. And they say, and you walked too far for the Sabbath day. And he's like, you're missing the part that I could see, right? He says, we don't believe your story. So they bring in his parents, he's an older man, like maybe 30 or something, and they bring in his parents, a grown man. Is this your son? Yes. Was he born blind? Yes. Can he now see? Obviously, he sees, he's looking. And the dad says, listen, his mother and I, we don't want anything to do with him. We don't want to get kicked out of the temple. We don't want to be disciplined for this. He's a grown man. He can speak for himself. And his own parents disown him because they don't want to get kicked out of fellowship. They don't want to get kicked out of the temple. They circle back around him and they say, tell us again how it is that you were able to see. He says, I'm so tired of telling you this story. I've already told you. There's no more details. This man named Jesus came. He put mud on my eyes, told me to walk, and then I could see. And then they ask him one more time, tell us the story. He says, why do you want to hear the story so much? Do you want to be one of his disciples? Well, that infuriates them. And then at one point they say, this man Jesus, what does he look like? And the dude was blind, like he doesn't know, right? So he's like, I don't know what he looks like. I've never seen him before. And so then they say this. They hearken back to, obviously they believe this. They say, you know what? You were born blind, therefore you were sinful in your mother's womb. And this just proves it. And they kick him out of the temple, kick him out of fellowship. If it were a movie, they would kick him down these stairs, and he would roll down these stairs and bump into a guy. And he looks up at this man, because it happens right after this. He looks up at this man, and he says, do you know who the Son of Man is? Asking about Jesus. And the man is Jesus. And Jesus says, again, it's me. There's parallels in John. It's me. You're looking at him. And the man worships Jesus. He weeps. He grabs his ankles, kissing his feet. It's a big scene. The Pharisees gather around the men who just kicked him out of the temple. And Jesus looks to them and he says this metaphor. They're going to be confused. Just fair warning. He says, this is why I came into the world, so that the blind could see, and so that those who see would realize they're blind. And then the Pharisees, Jesus, are you saying we're blind, we can see fine? And he says, no, I'm saying if you were blind, you could see. And clearly, the point of this in John, there's the story, but the point behind the story is that the religious are so unaware of their spiritual blindness that they can't see Jesus for who he is. But the blind, physically blind and spiritually blind, are the ones weeping at Jesus' feet, thanking him for saving them and rescuing them. And Jesus is using the Sabbath stuff as a strategy to get his message across to both sides. Our buddy Nicodemus we talked about is going to be, we assume Nicodemus is part of this whole council and is in these stories without saying anything, and he's watching. And he's going to be the only one of all of them that decides maybe Jesus is who he says he is. So there's hope for the religious. Just like in Luke, it seems like there's no help for the rich at all. But Zacchaeus, the rich con man, he comes to Jesus. And it seems like there's no hope for religious at all in John, but this one guy comes. But what is clear in all the Gospels is that the blind, whether that's physical or just you're spiritually blind, like you're just lost in darkness, those are the ones that come to Jesus. And the ones that think they got all figured out, super hard to accept him. All right, that's it, guys. End of that story. Have a great day. See you Wednesday.